Hello class. Please be informed first that this PowerPoint presentation goes with an audio and is in MP4 format. So in case you do not hear the audio, kindly adjust the settings and reopen the file. In this presentation, I will discuss the nature of moral statements and the characteristics of moral standards. How are moral standards different from the other standards of judgment? Actually, these topics are fundamental topics in metaethics, which is the first subject area in the discipline of ethics that we will tackle. It is important that we know, first of all, what is the status of moral statements. Whenever we make a moral claim or a moral statement like abortion is morally wrong, or you ought to fulfill what you promise to that person, what kind of statement or claim are we making? How are they different from the other statements we make? Knowing what is the nature of moral statements will shed light on how do we properly evaluate the acceptability of a particular moral statement. The thing is, the acceptability of the various statements we make and how we justify them depend on the kind of statements they are. Um, and then we will discuss the basis of judging moral statements. How do the standards we use to accept or reject moral claims differ from other standards? So these are two very important topics that need to be clarified on first so we can understand better the succeeding issues we will discuss in ethics. Let us begin with what moral statements are. Moral statements cannot be regarded as descriptive or empirical claims which pertain to objects that have natural properties and thus can be verified or falsified through scientific observation or investigation. These are the claims that we technically categorize as factual statements. For example, we cannot empirically demonstrate the morality of capital punishment. Whether it is morally permissible or not is not a factual matter. Here, what we can empirically establish is the fact that there is a person criminally sentenced to death lying on some bed and to be injected with lethal dose. But whether the act is morally right or wrong cannot be empirically demonstrated given the absence of observable natural facts that will prove the moral rightness or wrongness of executing a person. This leads thinkers to distinguish moral statements from other statements that we regard as factual. They rather regard and categorize moral statements as normative statements, since moral realities can only be expressed not in natural terms but in normative terms. So what are normative statements? So here we have two sets of statements. So what do you notice about these statements? Are there differences between the two sets? Are there differences between the statements in the same set? So what we have in the first set or left column are statements that we can categorize as normative. What we have in the second set are factual statements. So how do normative statements differ from factual statements? So we'll go back to these examples later. A normative statement expresses a value judgment and the basis we use to assess its correctness lies on a certain norm or standard. A factual statement, on the other hand, makes a claim about natural realities that can be assessed as true or false based on either research, observation, or experiment. Normative statements differ from factual statements the way they are justified, the way they are confirmed or assessed. We appeal to certain standards when we are dealing with normative statements. On the other hand, we appeal to the results of research, experiment, or observation when we are dealing with factual statements. So notice the key terms there: what ought to be the case and what is the case, which goes back to Hume's distinction. Okay, so going back to our examples, regarding factual statements, whether the Philippine independence was declared on June 12, 1946 can be determined through historical research, and whether tribes in India practice cannibalism can be determined by observation. The third statement is based on scientific research, while the fourth is based on empirical experiment. So we evaluate these statements using scientific empirical procedures. Now let us turn our attention on the other column. We accept or negate these claims not through empirical verification, but on their conformity to certain standards. And we can see that normative statements are not the same with each other. So although all moral statements are normative statements, not all normative statements are moral statements. Can you distinguish these differences? So which of these statements are moral statements? So actually there's only one. No? The first example there, you ought to return the excess change to the cashier. The others are not, which leads us to the point that normative statements vary in kinds because they have their own corresponding kind of norm or standard as basis of assessing their acceptability. So the first statement, no, you ought to return the excess change to the cashier, can be assessed by moral standard. The statement, there should be unity, balance, and contrast in your painting, can be assessed by aesthetic standard. Whether you ought to use the preposition in rather than on depends on grammatical standard. Whether you should cover your mouth when you laugh has to do with the standards of etiquette our society has. So it is important to emphasize that since a moral statement is a normative statement rather than a factual one, it cannot be justified by merely appealing to facts, empirical evidences, or data. Although providing facts may be significant in justifying a moral claim, this remains insufficient. I just want to reiterate my example before on the argument for death penalty. So let us have this argument. According to a study of 10 countries that enforce the death penalty, the rate of criminality in these countries went down after it has been enforced. Therefore, it is morally right to enforce the death penalty. The premise supporting the above moral claim is a statement of fact. This statement is established by gathering statistical data to arrive at a factual claim. However, to make a moral conclusion that imposing the death penalty is right needs more than merely providing a factual statement or information. There is a need to connect the factual statement with the moral conclusion by supplying certain moral standards or principles, such as an act is right if it promotes the greater good of the people. Thus, the moral argument should be imposing the death penalty will lower the rate of criminality in our society and thus will be beneficial to the greater number of people. An act is right if it promotes a greater good of the greater number, therefore, imposing the death penalty is right. The moral principle, no, the second statement, added as a premise in the argument, is not factual by nature. It was not derived from appealing to research or experiment. But without citing this moral standard, the fact that death penalty has brought down the rate of criminality in countries that have imposed it cannot suffice to justify that death penalty should be imposed. This point can be explained more by stating that though some people may also accept or agree, no, with the fact that death penalty can reduce the rate of criminality in our society, they still hold that it is morally wrong to impose the death penalty, as they believe that the right to life of a human being is sacred and inviolable. Thus, despite the greater good to society that the imposition of death penalty may bring about, it remains for them morally unacceptable. So we can see here that determining the rightness or wrongness of imposing death penalty does not only lie on establishing certain facts, but deciding what moral standards or principles to follow, pursuing the greater good or respecting the human rights of individuals. One accepts a moral claim not by looking at the facts alone. In the final analysis, one agrees or disagrees with a moral claim, not a moral claim on the basis of the moral standard he or she follows or believes in. So, such distinction of factual and moral statements makes people think that factual statements are easier to settle than moral statements, since the basis of the latter, now being true or false, is objective. That is, if there is a disagreement between two people whether the rate of criminality has gone down this year compared to last year, or whether a drug can cure a particular disease, the results of scientific research can clearly determine who is correct and who is mistaken. However, it is said that disagreements on moral claims, whether we should allow homosexual marriage or not, whether euthanasia is permissible or not, are more difficult, if not impossible, to settle or be given any final resolution. It is for this reason that moral claims are said to be relative and their acceptability lies on one's personal opinion or cultural beliefs. Although this question on whether moral claims are relative or not will be extensively discussed in another topic, it is worth mentioning at this point that it is a mistake to think that moral statements are always difficult to justify and their acceptability is always subjective to the individual. The claim, for example, that it is morally wrong to torture a person for fun, or the assertion it is morally right to give aid to typhoon victims, is not difficult to justify. It is also incorrect to think that issues dealing with factual claims are always easy to resolve or uncontroversial. Certain factual claims cannot easily be established. For example, no, did humans really evolve from primitive primates? Does imposing the death penalty really deter murder? Does intelligent life exist in other planets? Actually, no, there are still a lot of factual questions about COVID-19. No? Where did this novel coronavirus really originate? Are children as susceptible as adults in contracting that disease? Can one be immune with a virus once infected? How long does immunity last? Can one get reinfected? Is this or that particular vaccine effective? So these have to do with factual claims, but we cannot easily resolve or settle what is the truth about these questions. Therefore, we cannot distinguish moral and factual statements in terms of the degree of difficulty disagreements about them can be resolved. What is clear, however, is the basis by which we determine the acceptability of these statements. For factual statements, we appeal to empirical data through research and observation. For moral statements, like other normative statements, we appeal to norms and standards. After distinguishing moral from factual statements, it is also important to point out the difference of moral statements from other normative statements. We have seen earlier that aside from moral statements, there are other statements that are normative, that is, those that are justified and accepted based on standards rather than on observable facts. However, the standards used to justify other normative statements are not moral standards. The standards of etiquette by which we judge manners as good or bad, the standards of law by which we judge an action to be legally right or wrong, the standards of language by which we judge what is grammatically right and wrong, the standards of aesthetics by which we judge good and bad art, the athletic standards by which we judge how well a soccer game or a football or a basketball game is being played, these standards are not moral standards. So how can we distinguish moral standards from non-moral standards? Addressing this question can shed light on how different moral statements are from other normative statements, as well as how distinct morality is from other normative systems such as etiquette, law, and religion. Ethicists have identified a number of characteristics that speak about the nature of moral standards. Although each of these characteristics may not be unique to moral standards, if taken together, they can distinguish moral standards from non-moral standards. First, moral standards deal with matters that we think can seriously harm or benefit human beings. The conventional moral norms against cheating or abusing others or killing deal with actions that can gravely hurt people, whether human dignity is respected or degraded, work conditions safe or dangerous, products are beneficial or detrimental to our health, are matters that affect human well-being. The standards that govern our conduct in these areas are moral standards. Second, moral standards have universal validity. They apply to all who are in the relevantly similar situation. So if it is morally wrong for a certain person A to do act X, then it is wrong to do X for anyone relevantly similar to person A. This characteristic is exemplified in the moral rule, do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. If we believe that abortion is morally wrong, or believe cruelty to animals is morally wrong, then we expect that people in other places follow the same belief, regardless of their culture or religion. Thus, we demonstrate, we rally for our moral beliefs. Other standards are only valid to a particular group governed by such standards. The rule on fasting at certain times is observed in some religions, but not to other religions or to non-believers. Etiquettes such as not wearing red in a funeral or taking off your shoes when entering a house are practiced in some cultures but not to others. And we do not stage a rally to impose these beliefs that are based on standards of etiquette, because we know no, their validity is confined to a particular culture and not to others. Third, moral standards are generally thought to have a particularly overriding importance. That is, people feel they should prevail over other values. A violation of the moral rule against killing or stealing is more important than a violation of the rules of etiquette or of grammar. Similarly, a moral judgment weighs more than an aesthetic judgment. Moral claims are also more important than claims pertaining to law. Thus, laws are questioned when they are thought to be unjust or are contrary to moral standards. It was Martin Luther King Jr. who said, "One has a moral responsibility to obey unjust laws." Moreover, legislators determine what laws to enact on the basis of certain moral principles, such as common good, respect for human dignity, fairness, and justice. This point will be elaborated more in the next section or our next discussion when we discuss morality and law. Fourth, moral standards are not established by the decisions of authoritarian bodies, nor are they determined by appealing to consensus or tradition. Laws and legal standards are established by the authority of the legislature. Religious beliefs and practices are taught by the church fathers and scholars. Rules of etiquette emanate from tradition and consensus. Moral standards, however, are not established by a particular authority. Instead, the validity of moral standards lies on the adequacy of the reasons that support or justify them. So long as these reasons are adequate, the standards remain valid. So, guided by these characteristics of moral standards, how in particular morality is different from law, etiquette, and religion, which are often identified with morality since these are also institutions that lay down certain norms that serve as our basis in determining what we ought to do and not do. So this will be the topic of my next presentation.